Hello and welcome to the first video of a video series entitled Understanding Compression. My name is Joe Gilder. I run the blog HomeStudioCorner.com and glad to have you here. Understanding compression is all about, as you might have guessed, compression. Compression is one of those things when you first start recording, you may not even know it exists. And if you're like me, you may go years without ever even using compression, much less knowing what it is and what it's used for. So over the years, I've learned about compression, and I've learned a lot of cool uses for it, and I want to share those with you. But first off, we need an overview of compression itself. Doesn't do us much good to talk about compression if we don't all have roughly the same understanding and definition of what it is. So that's what this little presentation is about, and then we'll dive into all sorts of good compression goodness. So let's start with the first obvious question. What is compression? Well, basically, compression is just automatic volume control. I've heard people describe it as if you're riding down in your car as a kid with your mom and you turn the radio up really loud. Whenever it gets to the really loud parts, she reaches over and turns it down for a second. That's kind of what compression is. It's simply, at its simplest form, it's turning a signal down when it gets above a certain level. So if you think it's more complicated than that, there are some other components and other characteristics to it, but at its very basic level, it's automatic volume control. Another way to put that is it decreases dynamic range. Now, you may be saying, decreases what? Well, dynamic range is simply the difference in volume between the louder parts and the quieter parts of a piece of audio. So let me give you an example. Let's say you recorded a vocal, and it's a pretty little vocal, and the quietest section was around 20 dB, and then the loudest section was around 80 dB. Now, if you don't know what dB is, that's fine. It's just a measurement of volume. That it's fairly arbitrary. So the quietest was measured at 20, the loudest was measured at 80, and that means we have a dynamic range of around 60 dB. Now, if we add a little compression to the mix, we can reduce that to 45 dB. So it went from 60 to 45. So the big question is, why? Who cares if we can reduce dynamic range? How does that help me make my recording sound awesome? Well, we're going to talk about that, and I'll definitely help you out. Okay, so we've covered what compression is, and obviously over the course of the next several videos, we're going to dive in deep into this, and we're going to flesh out the things we're talking about in this video. So if you've got questions, don't worry. They're going to be explained, and it's going to all come together by the time you get through with the series. All right, so the next question we have is, why do we use compression? Well, there's a couple reasons. 3 reasons mainly that I could come up with. The first is to prevent clipping. That's probably the very first thing you'll use compression for, is just to help out and keep your tracks from clipping. I've got a little graphic over here that might help. Here's a vocal, and basically we're looking at the vocal here. This is that one we were just talking about. So up here is, let's say that's 80 dB, down here's 20. Doesn't really matter, but this is the volume of that vocal. At any point throughout the song, the vocal gets up to this loud and gets down to being this quiet. But we notice here at this line, there's clipping, and we need the vocal to not cross over that line. Well, what do? Well, we add in a little compression, and before we know it, we've squashed this vocal down, and now it's below clipping, so it's not clipping anymore. So if you can look at the before and the after, over here, it's a fairly tall line. Over here, we squished it. We compressed it. If you're wondering why it's called compression, you're compressing something. You're squashing it down and making it smaller. In this instance, we're squashing down the dynamic range. Dynamic range is another word for volume, and we're making this have a lower difference in volume from the loudest to the quietest part, but now it's not clipping, which is a really good thing. Okay, so the first thing we talked about is it prevents clipping. The second thing you can use compression for is to make loud parts quieter. So it's along the same lines as what we just talked about, but let's just say, for example, this little arrow and clipping was gone, and the vocal isn't clipping anything, it's just too loud. There are sections in the song where it sticks out way too loud above all the other instruments. Well, we just introduce compression again and bring that louder part down. So same basic concept there, nothing terribly different from the first one, but they are 2 different things, so we need to make sure we categorize those separately. And the third thing is make quiet parts louder. Now, if you've been doing compression for a while, you've come across this and you know what I'm talking about. But if you haven't, this may seem a little contradictory. You may be saying, Joe, didn't you just say that compression is used to turn things down? What do you mean it's going to make quiet parts louder? Well, it's going to make more sense as we get into the compressor and looking at the different components, particularly the makeup gain knob. but let me show you in another graphic. Let's take the same vocal we were looking at here, and instead of the arrow signifying clipping, let's say that down here, this is a fairly dynamic vocal, sang fairly loud and very quietly, and down in the quiet section, there's this really cute, breathy verse. So, and that's something you want to come out. So this may be one of those kind of a pop jazzy tunes where the girl is singing, and she sings really quietly on the verses, and then she sings really loudly on the choruses. But if you bring the choruses down to where that's not too loud, suddenly the breathy part of the verse is lost and you don't hear it. Well, add a little compression, and then suddenly you'll notice that the really cute breathy verse is now way up here as opposed to way down here. If we look at it all together, it's jumped up from here in level to here. We did the same thing we did in the other diagram where we made this dynamic range smaller. We squashed it, we compressed it. But in this instance, instead of bringing the high part down in volume, we took the low part and brought it up. So now those quieter, breathy parts are much closer in volume to the louder parts. Now, that you can certainly take that overboard, and we'll talk about that as well. But in general, that's a really good practice and can be really helpful when you're mixing. So as we said here, if you can turn your head sideways, you'd see it. You use them to prevent clipping, to make loud parts quieter, and to make quiet parts louder, and that's why we use compression. Now, another question, what are some common uses of compression? Well, that's a great question. We talked about what it does. What specifically does that mean in the course of a session? I've got about 5 tips here. The first thing is to control peaks. So we mentioned that before. It helps prevent clipping. It turns down louder parts, and there may just be a section where the signal just jumps up louder than everything else. For example, on the snare drum, it's really common in a drum kit for the drummer to not hit the snare at the same volume every time, and that's fine, but sometimes he may hit it a lot louder than he hits it the rest of the time, and that's going to really jump out. And if you have the snare nice and loud in the mix already, and then he hits it really hard, that's going to come out really loudly, and if it doesn't clip anything, it's still going to be so loud that it's uncomfortable and doesn't sound right. A compressor can take those extra loud sections and turn those down automatically for you. Again, we're talking about automatic volume control. The next one here is to normalize a track. Now, I put it in quotes here because to normalize a track is a specific task, and it doesn't actually involve compression, but in theory, compression can do somewhat of the same thing. And what I mean by normalize is not the definition of normalize, where you take the loudest part and bring it up as loud as it'll go. That's what normalization is. What I'm talking about is taking a track and doing what we did in that diagram to where the quiet part is a little louder, louder part's a little quieter, so it has a more consistent volume. And that works really well on vocals, like we talked about with the snare drum. Bass guitar, really effective at keeping those notes all the same volume or very close to it. And there's just an endless number of possibilities for that. Okay, the third way is to make a track sound up front or in your face. If you listen to any popular radio or any just regular rock or pop record that comes out, most likely that vocal is going to be way up in your face. And you may try to do that with your mixes, and you find that it's just too loud, it's overbearing, it hurts your ears, it seems like it's way out on top of the mix as opposed to still blending in with it. And the main difference is probably compression. They compress the vocals in those mixes quite a bit to make them sound so upfront and in your face. So there's no little piece of the vocal that jumps out more than anything else because it's all been squashed fairly good. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It can sound really good, just if you do it right. Number 4, to make a track sound tight. This is along the same lines as number 3. But it's hard to explain without hearing it, and we're going to get into in the later videos actually listening just to what compression does to a sound. We're going to do that fairly soon, actually, so that you're familiar with what the sound of compression is. But one key word to describe that is a feeling of tightness. You put it on a vocal, suddenly the vocal sounds a little bit strained, a little bit tight. You put it on a bass guitar, it sounds tighter. Acoustic guitar, it sounds tighter. It's just that's kind of the idea. So if things are feeling fairly loose, and I know these are kind of subjective terms, compression might be the ticket to making that sound tighter. Okay, and number 5, to make a track louder without clipping. Now, this gets at what we were talking about with that quiet vocal that was very quiet. We use compression to bring that up in volume. Well, you can do that to the entire mix itself. So you're taking an entire mix and you're turning everything down and compressing it, and then you're turning once you've squashed it and turned it down, you're bringing that overall level back up to a nice loud level. And that's a lot of what happens in mastering, is they take a track with a lot of dynamic range and they reduce that a little bit to make sure it's loud enough for the record. So that doesn't mean you need to overdo it and have it be super loud, but oftentimes a nice loud record without over compressing things can sound really nice. Okay, so those are some common uses of compression. And the next thing we're going to jump into is what are the components of a compressor and what do they do? And we're actually going to do that in the next video. I'm going to jump into Pro Tools and we're going to take a look and go in depth through a couple different compressors, show you all the components, explain to you in depth what they do, how to use them and why you would want to use them, and why you would not want to use them depending on the situation. And so that's it for this first video of understanding compression. Again, my name's Joe Gilder. And we've covered, over the course of this video, we've covered what is compression, why do we use compression, what are some common uses of compression, and in the next video we're going to cover the common components of a compressor and how they work. So if you are interested, if you're watching this as one of the free videos that I'm giving away and you want to jump in on the entire series and purchase that, you can get that at understandingcompression.com. Thanks for watching. Hope it helped.